Does anybody except Heike know German? What is Baum? Does anybody know what the Baum is in German?
Tree. Build.
A tree.
Tree. Oh.
Yes. So this is the family tree, Stammbaum, of the Uri family. This is the 5 generations, and what we're trying to tell you is, why can we tell this story? Now, many people have said to me, I wish I'd asked my grandparents more questions about where we came from. And in many cases, of course, it's too late. But in our case, we have amazing records, and you'll see as the talk goes forward. Why do we have such wonderful records? Well, first of all, one family lived in Berlin for 174 years. The Germans, as we know, kept excellent records. They kept excellent records of their good deeds and their bad deeds, but they kept wonderful records which helped us. Another reason we know a lot about this family is that my grandfather's sister, and her name was Elsa Uri, she was a very famous author of children's books. She sold over 7 million books between 1900 and 1930. And her biographers have done a lot of the spade work for us, and that's why we know so much about her and the family. We also are lucky enough to have 200 letters. They were written from Berlin and later from Amsterdam, detailing what it was like from 36 to 43 as the Nazis tightened the noose. And in those letters, which I've read and they're very moving, you can see how desperate the Jews were getting as the Nazis tightened the noose. And finally, we have my grandfather Ludwig, who you'll meet with his wonderful moustache. And Ludwig was managed to get out of Germany in 1939. How did he get out? Well, my father, Fritz, was already settled in England, nothing to do with Hitler. Way before Hitler, he left Germany for business reasons. So he got my grandfather out. And there my grandfather Ludwig sat for 24 years in exile. He was 69 when he left Germany. And he decided to write a very gossipy account of every member of the family that he could record. So, for example, he mentions his cousin Louis, who was a doctor, and his brother, who was a doctor. And he says they were wonderful doctors, but they died in their mid-30s because they were womanizers, and they died of syphilis. So this is pretty amazing details that we get. So thank you, Grandpa, for all that information. When we get to the Holocaust, it's very important for us to remember how the Jews have been perceived for 1,000 years. And let's look at it. You can see the illustration on the top left. That's a typical illustration from the 18th century of a Jew, a pawnbroker, or some sort of peddler peddling his wares. On the bottom left is, of course, a Nazi illustration of the greedy Jew putting his hand out. So you have to remember that the Jews were always outsiders for 1,000 years. Never quite belonged. They were a bit like the gypsies. They were tolerated, but sometimes they were expelled, and sometimes they were given privileges. But they never felt secure, and they were pawnbrokers, peddlers, cattle dealers. They were the wandering Jew. Every Sunday, the priests would remind their congregation, the average German, who had killed Christ. And who do you think killed Christ? The Jews. So, and worse of all, they still didn't acknowledge Christ as their Savior. I want to also say at this point that anti-Semitism was always bubbling below the surface. And although the Jews sometimes forgot this, there was always this feeling that somehow or other they were different. There was an invisible wall. By the way, that's the name of a book, The Invisible Wall, which I recommend. Give you some early family history. There were no Jews allowed in Berlin until 1660, none at all. In 1712, the ruler of Prussia, remember there was no Germany at the time, the ruler of Prussia said to the Jews, you can build an inconspicuous synagogue. But at this point, there's a very momentous episode in the history of the Uri family, and that is that in 1770, if you look up at the screen, Hirsch Lesinger, who was my grandfather's great-grandfather, came in from Czech, what is now Czech Republic, and he came from Hotzenplotz. Well, Des and I started giggling when we heard Hotzenplotz. We thought, there can't be a place called Hotzenplotz. But we looked it up, and yes, it's actually a place, Ossoblauer, which is another name in Czech for the same place. So anyway, Hirsch comes in from Hotzenplotz, and we know that he had to come through a special gate into the city. And this was the Rosenthaler Gate. And how do we know he came through the Rosenthaler Gate? Well, it was reserved for Jews and for cattle. So now you have an idea of what the Germans thought of the Jews. German, cattle, and Jews. The next 100 or so years, we call the Jewish utopia. And what we're trying to do, Des and I, in this talk, is show you not just about the Holocaust, but actually the German Jews had some wonderful, wonderful years where they flourished. So Moses Mendelssohn he came to Berlin penniless to work with the rabbi, but he said to the Jews, you have to give up your medieval ways, you should dress differently, you should speak German, and you should reform your religion. And Moses Mendelssohn was actually the grandfather of the composer, I wish Judy Drucker were here, she was of course, the grandfather of Felix Mendelssohn. Anyway, Moses Mendelssohn, what he really said was, you could be a Jew at home, and you could be a German in the street. And this was a problem that the German Jews struggled with for well over 100 years. Were they Germans of Jewish descent, or were they Jews who happened to live in Germany? Very, very difficult struggle. So on the left is a menorah. Do you see the menorah there on the left? And do you see it morphing into a Christmas tree?
Yes.
Well, that tells the story of assimilation. Just that one illustration. A bush, a Hanukkah bush, whatever you want to call it, but there it is. And religion was left behind in those years, 1790 to 1870, 50% into marriage, which may sound actually familiar because I think that the statistic isn't far different today. But there was mass conversions. It was very easy to convert. It was a 5-minute thing. You just said, I do, and that was it. And it was pretty cheap. So that there were the Jews. They celebrated Christmas with their neighbors, and they were integrated. And they had this comfortable middle-class existence. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the contribution of Jews to German life. I won't go through every name, but just a few that stand out. Sigmund Freud, Albert Einstein, Kafka, when he was Czech, Gustav Mahler, and Karl Marx. And it goes on and on and on. And the Jews were absolutely foremost in literature and music, science, and in business. One thing I'd like to ask you is, how many of you have seen Fiddler on the Roof? Everybody? I'm sure most of you have seen Fiddler on the Roof. Well, if you remember, Tevye was a milkman. Remember, with 5 unmarried daughters? And he talked to God, remember that? Well, Tevye lived, I think, either in the Ukraine or in Russia somewhere. And remember, it was a very difficult existence. They were poor, and they were subject to the pogroms and being killed by the Russians whenever they decided to attack them. Well, I want to just to juxtapose that and say, at the same time as Tevye was talking to God and milking his cows, the German Jews were going to the opera. So what a contrast between two different, at the same time, different civilizations. Here's the family. The top two are the grandsons of Herr Schlesinger, who you remember came from Hotzenplotz. And they had 4 children. On the left is Grandpa Ludwig with his famous moustache, Grandfather Gossett. On his right is Hans, who was his younger brother, who was a doctor, a gastroenterologist. Then there's Elsa, the writer who sold 7 million books, and then her younger sister, Käthe, who was a teacher. Now I'm going to hand over to Des, who'll tell you about Elsa.
Just to talk about Elsa first, who was the most famous of the 4 siblings, she, as John had told you, wrote children's books. Between 1900 and 1930, she wrote 10 volumes of books for little girls. And she was raised in this cultured, upper middle class family, and generations of young girls and women read her books. And the heroine, I think, kind of needs a little mention. The heroine of the book was a little Aryan girl, blue eyes, blonde hair, lived in a privileged German home, daughter of a doctor, and she traces her life from little girl playing with her dolls to adolescence to growing up, and she actually becomes a doctor. So in 1926, it was rumored that Elsa Urey wasn't writing any more books. And she was so beloved by these generations of little girls and women. She had written 6 volumes, and there was actually a national outcry, and she wrote 4 more volumes. So we look at who she was, a very, very nationalistic, patriotic, assimilated Jewish woman, more German than Jewish. And we wonder, when all the happenings took place after 1933, after Hitler came to power, and there were all sorts of rumors and talk about what was happening. Was she politically naive? Or was she, as so many German Jewish people, in denial? Because it's interesting that nowhere in her books, in the flaps of her covers, about the author was it ever mentioned that she was of Jewish origin and that she was Jewish. And so now 3 very dramatic things happened when Hitler came to power in 1933. Very, very rapidly. She was expelled from the Writers' Guild for being Jewish. She was rounded up and put in a Jewish hostel, as many Jews were rounded up in different parts of Eastern Europe and Europe. And we actually saw this hostel when we visited Germany. Why do I mention the address? You're going to see in a few slides later. It was 10 Sollingerstrasse. That was the address of the hostel, a small corner building where many, many, many Jewish families were rounded up and crowded into this hostel before the 3rd thing that happened. They were shipped in cattle cars to Auschwitz. And it makes us shudder, actually, when we've heard from John about Moses Mendelssohn, about his grandfather from Hotzenplotz, who came through a gate reserved for cattle and Jews. So now we just think again, imagining, or unbelievable to think, of something like this ever happening to a famous author of Judy Blume fame in the United States, A.J. Milne, who wrote Winnie the Pooh, or J.K. Rowling of Harry Potter fame. Incredible to even conceive of people of this category and fame being shipped off to be murdered because of their religion. Fast forward 40 years. Elsa Urey was murdered in Auschwitz in 1943. 1983, way after the war, a TV series is being made about her books. The fame was just incredible. And there was a TV series in Germany, immensely popular, and again, 40 years later, nowhere was it mentioned that she was Jewish or what her ultimate fate had been. And now, fortunately, she is memorialized. And again, during our visit in 2017 to Berlin, we see a street named after her, Else Uri Burgen, John standing underneath the archway, her books being sold in bookstores in Germany, and there's a library that is named after her in Berlin. So certainly with plaques, with memorials, she is now remembered. And here we come to a very moving part of our documentation. As John mentioned right at the beginning of the talk, we're very fortunate to have many documents and records. And let's look first at the house. I'm trying to get the pointer, but we see at the bottom of this slide a beautiful home. She amassed quite a bit of money in her day and selling her books. And she had a house in the mountains where she retreated and entertained family and friends. And the moment that she was shipped off to Auschwitz, we have a document from the Germans legitimizing why they were able to appropriate her home. And the reason that's documented is that the owner abandoned her house. We look in the top right, we see again the Germans and their immaculate records. That is the inventory of what was stolen from her home. The inventory of her possessions, her furnishings, her clothing, up to the last pair of shoes, the upper right. The lower left is a transport list. And we have a lot of these documents in these books that we have on the table, if anybody wishes to look at it afterwards. Also, Uri's name is highlighted in red. This must have been the last of many, many pages of the Jews who were transported on that particular day, the 12th of January, 1943. And what it says, it's difficult to see, and we've actually kept it in its unrecovered manner in the documents. It says, 12th of January, 1943, Else Uri on the transport list. The top picture of the suitcase is probably the most moving of this whole presentation. We, as Jewish people, non-Jewish people who have been to Holocaust museums, have images of piles and piles of shoes, of spectacles, of suitcases. We know that the Jews were told they were being resettled and that they could take one suitcase with possessions with them. For those of us who have seen Schindler's List, there's a very amazing memory that I think we recall of the Jews being shipped in a closed, windowless cattle car, and the Nazis, as the train is pulling out of the station, are opening the suitcases and taking their valuables. In 1995, a group of German school children were visiting Auschwitz on a field trip. Amazingly, this suitcase, amongst the piles and masses of suitcases on display, the suitcase was turned in a way where her name and her address at the hostel was visible. And one of the young girls on the field trip who had read her books exclaimed, "There is Else Uri's suitcase." Well, the upshot is that the suitcase was retrieved, it's been treated, and it is currently under lock and key in Auschwitz, not actually in full view of the museum, but it is locked away on the second floor in a building in Auschwitz. And when we visited in 2017, the curator of the archives opened up the building, the floor, and the drawer where the suitcase was housed. She pulled open the drawer, we put on gloves, and we were actually able, in most amazingly emotional moment, to touch and open the suitcase. things happen very serendipitously. We are busy doing these presentations at various places, and in July, we were notified through the family, John's family, that the New York Times was going to be having a series on people who were overlooked and didn't have an obituary. And who was featured just 2 months ago, on July 15, 2019, in the New York Times, a half page of history and writing and an abbreviated biography of Elsa Uri. And so this is what it stated: overlooked no more. Elsa Uri's book survived World War II. She did not. Uri's books about a German girl were so beloved, readers clung to them through the upheaval of World War II and passed them on to their children. But few knew, as we've said before, that the author had died in Auschwitz. I'm going to move on to the youngest sibling, Kada. Kada was the teacher, as you may recall. She was married to a very German, Jewish gentleman who had fought in World War I, had got an Iron Cross, who was a civil servant in Berlin, who did not, under any circumstances, believe that anything would happen to the Jews. They would be protected because of his history. Unfortunately, that was not the case. If we look at the picture on the right, there are 3 children. The one in the middle is Lisbeth, and she is the oldest daughter of Kada and Hugo, and she and her husband and young son, who was about 11 at the time, were able to move to Amsterdam, relocating her husband's business. And eventually, Kada and Hugo were persuaded to go to Amsterdam, believing that Holland was a neutral country. But as many of us know, Hitler invaded Holland, and they were again rounded up and sent to initially Westerbroek and ultimately to Bergen-Belsen and murdered in Theresienstadt about 1 year and 9 months after Elsa Uri died in Auschwitz. We come to a little bit of a happier part of the story now. We have 2 children, the young girl on the right and the little baby boy who's depicted in the picture. And again, we thank John's gossipy grandfather, Ludwig, who tells us that Ilse on the right was the black sheep of the family. Why was she a black sheep? She smoked, she moved out of home, she lived with a man, she studied agriculture, she spoke Yiddish, which was, to the German ear, bastardized German, and she was a Zionist. And she announced, to her parents' absolute chagrin, that she was going to Palestine. And from Ludwig's memoirs, it is understood that the family didn't know where Palestine was. And they twirled the globe of the world looking for where Palestine was on the map, thinking that she was going to be living in a tent in unsanitary condition amongst the Arabs. Anyway, fast forward a year later, she writes and says that she's married, she has a baby, and the baby's name is Gabby. And the parents wrote back and said, you better send Gabby back to Berlin because you're incapable of raising a child. Well, fortunately, Gabby was not sent back to Berlin because Gabby was raised in Israel. He's 80 years old now, lives in Tel Aviv with children and grandchildren, and happy to say, John is in close touch with the family in Israel, the descendants of Ilse. And let's look very quickly at the little baby, Klaus, on the left in the picture. Klaus was able, by good fortune, through John's parents, who were British subjects at this time, to come to London, where he studied architecture. Miraculous things that we hear. He brought out his childhood sweetheart. He was 18 years old at the time and was later able to bring out his high school sweetheart to London. And there are a couple of documents about how he did that in the book. And the amazing thing is that he was raised a family in London. And just go back to the 200 letters that John told you about. The 200 letters that give us so much insight into what was going on during Hitler's rise to power were from his mother Kader, first from Berlin and subsequently from Amsterdam. So if we look at this little baby, he was actually born in 1918, and his family, children, grandchildren, great-children, are in touch with John. But of course, having been born in 1918, he passed away at the age of 99 last year, 2 years ago. And now, John is going to tell you about a cousin of his.
Very briefly, Bertel Borowski was born in 1924. She's still alive, living in Oakland, California. And she did survive Auschwitz. And she'll tell you in her own words in a second what it was like. But because she was born in 1924, in 1933, when Hitler came to power, she was only 9 years old. And she described to me, and also into her testimony, to show what it was like that overnight her Gentile friends of 9-year-olds stopped talking to her. She was robbed of her childhood, she told me, and of course her education. She couldn't go forward with the schools that Nazis had forbidden Jews to have more education. She was shipped eventually in 1940, I think it was 1943, to Auschwitz, to Theresienstadt first, and then to Auschwitz. As I said, this has a happy ending. She describes what life was like in Auschwitz, and fortunately she was survived, and the American forces liberated Auschwitz in 1945, and Bertel picked herself up, joined her brother and sister in New York, studied to be a nurse, and eventually she achieved what was, at that time, the ultimate Jewish girl's dream. She married a Jewish doctor. He was a Jewish doctor in the American Navy. And they had 2 boys. They were madly in love with each other. They held hands all the time. And they had 2 boys who both became doctors. Desiree.
One more. No.
To click it.
We arrived in Auschwitz when it was still dark. There were huge lights, so-called Scheinwerfer, big floodlights that shone on us. And we could see SS in great numbers with dogs, with guns, with whips. We saw prisoners, we saw people in prisoners' uniforms, blue and white stripes, looked quite gaunt and without any expression. In the background, we saw smokestacks belching smoke and flames continuously. We didn't really know what to make of all this. We were put into 2 distinct groups, and one of the SS men would call our names and direct us left or right. We had no idea what all this meant. Women were separated from their husbands, wives and husbands separated, women and separated from their children and parents. It was quite bewildering. We were then taken into barracks where we were stripped of our clothing. everything we owned was taken away. Our hair was shaved, and we were issued prisoners' uniforms. In a matter of minutes, we were stripped of our identities.
Yes, well, it took us a long time to persuade Bertelle to tell the story, and in her memoirs, sometimes it's amazing. It's almost like because she's trying to tell her story, she tells it almost in the third person that it happened to somebody else. But we find that extremely moving, and that's how she... Anyway, let's go back a bit in history. We all know that in 1933, Hitler came to power. And if those of you who know about Hitler, at first, Hitler was comic relief. I don't know if any of you have seen Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator. But they make a lot of fun of his exaggerated movements and his shouting. But of course, he was no joke. And a lot of people at the time, I've read a lot about this, thought that Hitler was a temporary phenomenon. Don't forget, we had the Great Depression. 5 million Germans were unemployed, and Hitler was promising a better future. So over the next few years, there was a build-up of a frenzy of hate against the Jews. And my mother, Helen, who was born in Germany, spoke fluent German, of course, was living in England with my father, decided she was going to go back to Germany, very courageous, and go into the lion's den. And what was the lion's den? It was, of course, Nuremberg. And if any of you have seen pictures of Nuremberg, if you remember, there were swastikas about 60 feet high, all orchestrated by Goebbels. And my mother sat there, and in those 5 days in a large field in Nuremberg, 700,000 Nazis screamed hate against the Jews. And my mother remembers coming back to England, and she had absolutely no doubt what was coming next. The Jews were blamed for everything bad in the world, massive unemployment, the defeat of World War I. Jews were subhumans polluting the German race. And in 1938, the hatred reached a climax in, of course, we all know it's coming up next month, Kristallnacht, November the 8th to 9th, the night of broken glass in 1938.
I'm going to read to you a report by a cousin of John's who was in Berlin on that 8th, 9th of November, 1938. And we look at this Kristallnacht as probably a turning point in the Jews' denial. If anybody and any German Jews were in denial about what was going on, this, of course, we call the wake-up call. And this is what John's cousin Marta wrote the next day to her son, who was in London, her account of this horrific event. I will never forget the St. Bartholomew night as long as I live. The banging, thunder-like crashing and shouting was unbelievable. It destroyed something deep inside of me. It destroyed my belief in humanity. We live among savages, my boy. One saw people unmasked, base and mean, enjoying the destruction. I cannot get rid of the feeling that this was done on order. We are not allowing the children to go to school because the churning Volksseele, that's the soul of the people, could flare up again. And this is just the beginning. Therefore, I beg you at least to save your sister before it is too late. If the conscience of the world does not wake up soon, we are lost. We are not even safe in our homes. The child was so shook up today that she cried bitterly. It hurt my innermost soul, believe me. And for all this, your father lost his arm and carries a wooden arm The hand he lost wore the iron ring with the inscription from the Germans, "The Fatherland's thanks."
Well, this slide really tells the whole story. On the left is the Great Synagogue of Berlin, built in the 1860s. And if you look at it, you see the proud towers, and it speaks of the importance of the German Jewish community and how they felt about their community. And on the right is the same place, the same synagogue after Kristallnacht. See all the shards on the floor. Nothing left. The comfortable world was turned upside down, and there you have the children, and we'll tell you about their fate. So all four at the bottom. There they were. Ludwig, my grandfather, he, as we all know, survived. He went to London and spent 24 years in lonely exile. He hardly spoke English. I knew him very vaguely, but we really couldn't communicate. But he died at the age of 93. On the right is his younger brother, Hans, who was the gastroenterologist and also did a lot with x-rays, which were just coming in. And Ludwig despaired, Hans despaired in 1937 because Hitler said no Jews could be doctors anymore. There were no Jewish doctors anymore. So he committed suicide, and he took an overdose of pills. Elsa, we've dealt with. Des has talked about her. She was shipped off straight to Birkenau. She was over 65, and if you were over 65, you went straight to the gas chambers. And Kata and her family, the five of them, fled to Holland, mistakenly thinking that there would be safety in Holland. And of course, the Germans invaded Holland and treated the Jews exactly the same way as they had in Germany. I'd like to summarize what we've told you. I'm going to come over here. We're going to summarize what we've told you in the last hour. First of all, we've tried to tell you the story of the Holocaust through a different way, through getting to know individual members, and we think that that's probably making it more real to us. We get to know these German Jews as individuals, such as Elsa, Kata, Bertel, going about their daily lives much as we do. And suddenly, they're faced with the horrors of living under the Nazis, being banned from daily life before being rounded up and then shipped off and exterminated. And in these letters, which I've read, there are 200, I haven't read all of them, but you feel the panic. And in one letter, which I found particularly moving, Kata, the younger sister, complains. She says, here we are, we have to go shopping, we have to send the kids to school, and we play cards. And there was a sort of German version of bridge. And she said, here we are, spending hours playing card games, while outside the world is shutting us out. Very, very moving. And we have these letters which you could cry just thinking of what happened. Anyway, they were desperately trying to get out of Germany. Should we go to Shanghai? Should we go to Cuba? Should we go to Bogota? Anywhere that would take them. And of course, we know that many countries shut them out. Their passports were taken away. And Kata writes in one letter, I've got my youngest son living in London, I've got Ilse living in Palestine, and I've got my other daughter we've got Kata living in Amsterdam. So she had 3 children overseas, and the police, without any explanations, just said, we're taking your passport away, you can't have it back. So that's how they were living. So we feel their pain and their panic. We cry with them as these people are herded into cattle cars, no longer human beings, to certain death. And I think it's important to remember that these are not remote ancestors from, the Middle Ages. These are the brothers and sisters of my grandparents. And the lesson that Des and I have taken from this is, first of all, you could be a good American, but don't forget your roots. And many German Jews did forget their roots. And secondly, if there is hate, let's be vigilant, not just against the Jews, but this is a much bigger thing. Hate against anybody, we should be vigilant. We ourselves asked some questions. We're going to open the floor now to questions and comments, but we ourselves wanted to tell you the sort of questions that we were asking ourselves. Were the Germans always Jew haters? Was the Holocaust inevitable? Why did it happen in Germany? How come many Jews didn't see what was happening until it was too late? And finally, we try to imagine ourselves living at that time, and we ask ourselves, what would you have done? What would you have done if you were living at that time?